Welcome to our week on schools and systems. The key message for this week is really quite straightforward. It's that we need to remember that the schools in which we work are part of a bigger system, nationally and internationally, and that the school in which we work sits in relationship to other schools nationally and internationally. And they are, in a sense, a system that does something. The question is largely, what is it that the system does? Does it actually provide opportunities for all individuals, or does it give legitimacy to social reproduction by validating people's outcomes in schooling and future life opportunities by the very credentials of schooling? Now, a couple of things I want to point out from the outset before we begin, somewhat tangential perhaps. This study by Hart and Risley is a classic, and the idea that children from high-income families experience 30 million more words within the first 4 years of life, or that the average child on welfare will learn 125,000 more words of discouragement than encouragement, or a child from a high-income family will hear 560 more words of praise than discouragement. So the point of highlighting this is when we're talking with children and trying to develop their capacities, particularly in the early primary years, we need to understand what they're coming to school with, and even that is the expectations of encouragement and discouragement. Okay, we in our tend to be middle class attitude would fall into the encouragement language phrase, but that's not necessarily the language that children from the more working class families found in this sort of study. Now, I've mentioned a number of studies and things. So on this slide are a number of books. These are some of the classic studies of the last maybe 12 years in this space. And they are the largest studies, well-funded, really good outcomes. Now, they all, bar Connell's over here, which is 82, the classic study set in Australia, but they all have really simple, and a lot of the journal articles, etc., have a really simple conclusion that I want to reiterate, and I think I've used already. That if you understand the children that you're teaching and the context from which they come to school from, and the nature of knowledge and their experiences and their understanding and familiarity with school, if you work with that knowledge, if you break down the assumptions in the curriculum and the knowledge and cultural assumptions in the curriculum, and work with kids positively to make that language knowable and those expectations and cultural assumptions knowable, then they will achieve. It's not rocket science. It makes sense. Studies have been showing it again and again and again. This is where the system comes in, though, because the system includes people who don't come from that background, who want the system to provide excellence, achievement, which then provides access to universities, professions, careers, other opportunities. So in a large social system, what we know works for those that are disadvantaged, whatever that cause of disadvantage may be, doesn't also work for those that are advantaged. Because for them, it provides legitimacy to position, status and power. So there is always going to be a tension between those two things, which might explain why, given the millions of dollars spent on these research projects, they haven't fundamentally changed the nature of curriculum or schooling. This next slide are some of the classic studies in the space that we're talking about here. Ivan Illich's Deschooling Society, over here, Pierre Bourdieu's Reproduction and Education, John Dewey, Paulo Freire, the Bernstein that I've mentioned, Michael Apple's famous study about knowledge, ideology and curriculum, and some of Richard Teese's work in Australia about examinations and social success and power and schooling as a undemocratic process. Okay, so if you're looking for a bit of extra reading to understand these things more broadly, these are some of the books that I would recommend to you. If you're looking for some studies to add to what I've been saying works, or to check those things, these are some of the classic studies. A couple of other key points. Policy gets mentioned in the chapters this week. Now, we need to remember that policy is about the distribution of scarce resources. So society pays taxes, government has taxes, they've got to work out how to spend that. in the education space, they've only got so much money, they're going to work out how to spend that. And that's influenced by things like values, governance and power. So different political parties have different values and ideologies. That puts them into different decision-making issues around whether it's about encouraging school choice, whether it's supporting students from whatever background that hasn't related to a lot of success in the past, etc. Okay, this is a democratic issue. So when we're talking school policy and debates, and politics, policy is politics. Okay, when the minister's out there and people are arguing about school funding or whatever the case is, that's politics. And it's inherent in what we do in schools. Okay. Issue we need to keep in mind about curriculum is that curriculum is about knowledge. Okay? Curriculum isn't policy. Curriculum is knowledge. So there is a relationship here because, again, it's about passing on knowledge and which knowledge do we choose. But policy tends to be about the actual money. Things we've seen with policy are things like the change in the standards regimes, etc. So you've got Connell's paper there talking about the good teacher. And in Connell's paper, she's sort of saying that, look, teaching is work. It's what we do. It's our work as teachers. But what a good teacher has changed over time. It's gone from being an obedient servant to a technical professional model where teachers had to show technical skills, to a scholar-teacher model in universities like where you are now, to the standards talking about competency. Okay, and when you go on prac, etc., it's about have you met your standards. So basically it's about being a good teacher is a competent teacher who meets standards. That is semantically very different to the notion that preceded that of the academic or the scholar teacher. So we're in a bit of a state here where the standards actually encourage a type of teacher which is different to the institutions in which teacher training is delivered, which is about the scholar teacher, given that universities are about knowledge and exploration of knowledge. So Connell's pointing out a nice bit of contradiction there about how the nature of what a good teacher changed. And that's because basically in a policy sense, teachers can regulate teacher competency through the standards. They can measure that. They can't measure the more academic side of teaching. So there is a policy imperative there. Rizvi and Lingard there talk about curriculum education policy on a global scale, basically saying that, look, what we think we should do in curriculum and what we should do in education policy is being talked about not just nationally or within a state, it's also a global phenomenon now. So we have the OECD test, the PISA test, the other international tests. These all basically compare systems. Interesting when we talk, say, about curriculum and staffing, though. We talk about rural schools, in my example, as having trouble getting teachers, but we don't actually talk about staffing and curriculum together. Okay? We know nationally we have a shortage of maths and science teachers, particularly physics and chemistry, but we talk about the need to develop physics and chemistry and mathematics skills in students, but we somehow separate those things out rather than linking them. Okay? That's because curriculum is knowledge, staffing is policy. But so this divide becomes problematic. And Rizvi and Lingard talk about here as this neoliberal imaginary. So that notion of neoliberalism, competition, and economic type thinking as being seen as the logic of all public order, when that's problematic. We see that, for example, remember the national goals of schooling. So you need to keep that stuff in mind. Okay, this is what governs the system. Okay, and we have our two current goals here: equity and excellence, all Australians to become successful learners, active informed citizens, and so on. But what you'll note over here is that this is the preamble before the goals, that it's basically about capacity to provide high quality of life for all will depend on the ability to compete in the global economy, on knowledge and innovation. So these goals are basically situated within a global economic outlook. So the global influence on Australian education is very strong. We need to keep that in mind when we're talking about changes and modifications. Murray Brennan's paper, very briefly, talks about basically the Australian curriculum as being part of a federalism movement. So moving towards one system for one nation, okay, which is a political move. So suggesting that the curriculum isn't just about knowledge, it's actually about control of Australian schooling, because as you know, It's based in each states have the legislative responsibility, not the feds. So this is a move to try to change some of that stuff. And things we're thinking about as you move on in this sort of stuff is, what is a good education? Okay? Is it about this sort of academic rationalism or learning for its own sake? Okay? Is it about preparation for work or development of skills? Should education be personally relevant or social good, preparing for democracy? Where does the need of the individual to get a job or to get a good mark sit in relationship of the broader social good that these people that we're teaching are going to make up society as a whole, not just workers or innovators? So there's a relationship between all of those things. Look, I won't worry about Bernstein too much, but Bernstein makes some interesting points about standardized testing, basically saying that relationships and standardized testing are socially empty. Okay, all that matters is results. Okay, so the social dimension of the teacher-student relationship is removed. Okay, and ends up in a scenario where teachers work at children. So rather than working with children, there's a working at them to get better grades. And that sort of diminishes things. A couple of last things I want to point out about the system, just to show relationships. Here, this is the issue of school choice. Look, I won't focus on too much detail here, but this is using some New South Wales data. Oopsie-doo. The red up here, so the red up here refers to selective schools in New South Wales. The green are independent schools, the blue you can't really see are Catholic, and the yellow are government schools. And this is basically reading, Year 9, that's the average grade, this is the ICSEA on the bottom, this is the average ICSEA. So what you can sort of see there is NAPLAN reading results in New South Wales are organised by whether you go to a government school, largely organised by whether you go to a government school, Catholic or independent school, which is also directly related to the ICSEA of the school. Interestingly, the independent, or so the selective schools, which are government schools, happen to have very high ICSEAs as well, which raises questions around the veracity of the entry test. Down here, this is what we call HSC success. That's the Year 12 exams or Year 12 results in New South Wales, and this is any student who got over 90% in any exam. And again, you can see that the schools, the colours here are about metropolitan and non-metropolitan because they're from some of my other work. But you can see that the schools where students are getting higher HSC results, including our red selective schools, all happen to have a higher ICSEA. So the point for our unit is, as much as we talk around opportunity, the system and the results that it gives out, both literacy here, Year 12 HSC results in New South Wales here, and the same stuff happens in other jurisdictions. We could show you the data on that. But it's organised by social background. Okay, this stuff's really persistent. If you look at ICSEA and academic hierarchies, you can see again, this is using ICSEA and NAPLAN data, looking at government, independent schools, Christian schools, Catholic, Anglican, etc. That basically the ICSEA, what happened then? The ICSEA and the NAPLAN, so the social background and NAPLAN, there's a relationship that is developmental across all of these, such that, largely speaking, with the exception here of some of the independent schools at the end here, okay, they're still getting higher NAPLAN scores based on the social background. That also correlates largely, or associates with, the ICSEA of the school. So these things matter. If you look in this example, this is from Wagga, from work by Chris Bonner. You can see that in Wagga, as an example, the schools there are organised along the ICSEA scale on the bottom here, and their weighted NAPLAN results, and that the independent sectors right up this end, higher grades, higher ICSEA, and the government sectors fall down. Or other issues like one particular school has nearly all the Indigenous students in it. Okay, so there's a whole lot of, even within one geographic school community, and I can show you the similar data for various other communities as well, it's not just Wagga, just happens to be the example he chose, that there's a whole lot of social segregation, sorting and organising going on. We also get reports like this, the PISA report. The 2009 one was on reading literacy, and you can see there that the systems are spread out. This one's got the Australian results on it. The ACT, we're over here, high quality, low equity with that stuff. But we compare ourselves just by putting a graph like this up. We want to see how we're comparing, and we want to get ourselves over to this column. Just a natural human instinct. But it shows you that not only is this a national thing, it's international. Or even if I look at national, international stuff, you can see the point I want to make with this slide is there's a relationship between, this is the Education and Advantage Index, so negative to positive, so less advantaged, more advantaged. Reading literacy, less reading, higher reading. That right across the OECD, there's a strong relationship between the two things. So this is not just a phenomenon that is unique to Australia, it's international. Okay, and just for Australian sake, you can see the same relationship, same line of relationship fits within all states and territories. The worrying one for us is that actually in the ACT, it has the highest relationship of social background and reading than any other jurisdiction in Australia. So that's something for us to be mindful of. But look, my point with some of these very quick graphs and tables to reinforce the thing in the book is everything we do sits in relationship to something else. Okay, we need to be mindful of where we sit in that relationship. Some of us will work in the more advantaged end, some of us will work in the less advantaged end. But we need to recognise that wherever we are, there is the other end. And that other end then becomes part of the social system. So while we might think some reforms are sensible or easy to achieve, they're often not delivered because of the influence of the other end. Because we exist in a society, and society has people who want to basically achieve the best they can for themselves. It doesn't mean they will give up something of themselves for another person. So there's always this relationship and tension.